So good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we just ran into a couple technical glitches this evening, but we're ready to get started, and we're really delighted that you stuck around and waited through that with us. So for those of you who were here last time or the time before, welcome back to Skills for Solidarity. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome to the program. We're really delighted that you are here with us. It's been a really great summer with you all so far, and I'm really excited to keep moving forwards in this exploration that we've started down about our shared history. And tonight we're going to continue doing that by diving into some commonly held myths and misconceptions that we, or maybe those around us, might be holding on to. But before jumping in, again, a couple quick updates from me. So the workbook for this module is available on the Module 3 page already, so if you haven't already gone there yet, you can head over there to download it whenever you'd like. And I've also posted just a couple of the questions from that into the forum, so if you want to start having conversations about some of the themes you're hearing about, you can head to the forum. And also, again, feel free to start new threads and new conversations if you're not seeing what you want in there. We're really open to that forum being a space that you shape and create in the way that works for you. And then finally, just keep checking that announcements page for updates on any interesting, cool initiatives that I'm hearing about. And if you know of any, send them our way, as we'd love to keep that space as a place where we can all keep updated on the program, but also hear a little bit more about what's going on around these themes. So for this week, again, to recap, we started this program off with stories, and then in the second panel we started to apply analysis to some of those stories by beginning to unpack the policies and practices that impacted and created and were a part of those stories. And now we're going to start digging into some of the myths that many people hold about our shared history. So again, like always, this isn't a comprehensive overview, this isn't everything that's out there, but it's providing a starting point for all of us to hear some bits of information and to encourage us all to then go and continue learning in other places and in other ways. So for some framing for this evening, I thought I'd share a very short story about a few years ago. I did a session about economics, and the person leading the conversation framed it in such a way that it wasn't so much about him downloading information to me and me sort of picking it up and using it, but rather he was framing it in a way that gave me tools and knowledge so that I could go out into the world and counter many of the commonly held myths about our economic system. So there's one out there around how looking out for the environment or climate is inherently bad for the economy. So whenever I now hear that myth being talked about or presented in the world, I have this little toolkit that I can dig into of information about how that's not actually true. So I'd encourage you to approach this panel in a similar way and think about what information you need so that you can counter the myths that are out there, either within you or in the communities and spaces where you live. We have three really great panelists this evening. I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. The first one is Matthew Wildcat, also Heather Dorries, and Jana Ray Yerksa, and I will again introduce them more fully before they speak. But we'll follow a similar format to the other two panels, with each of them speaking somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes, and then we'll follow that up by a Q&A session. Unfortunately, Ellen Gabriel isn't able to join us. I know she really wanted to be here, but was unable to make it this evening. But I know that the three that we do have are going to bring a really incredible perspective to us all tonight. And then finally, as per usual, if you do have a question, send us an email at skillsforsolidarity@Leadnow.ca, or post a tweet using hashtag skills4solidarity. This info is also available on the site beside where you're watching, and I've got Leslie and Kelly from the Leadnow team here ready to receive all your questions. And Matthew's also working away in the background to keep our tech running smoothly now that we've got going. So send questions at any time, but whatever you'd like. If they're for a specific panelist, then you can let us know. Otherwise, we'll just sort of ask broadly who would like to respond. So that's all for me. I'm really excited to introduce our first panelist. So Matthew Wildcat is a Nehiyaw Plains Cree and grew up in the Plains Cree community of Musqueam. He is also an Ermineskin Cree Nation member. Matthew holds a BA Honors in Native Studies from the University of Alberta and a MA in Indigenous Governments from the University of Victoria. He's currently a PhD student in political science at UBC in Vancouver, with a focus on the Plains Indigenous political history. And in his research, he seeks to understand the impact of settler colonialism on Indigenous political orders and think about how Indigenous peoples can enact meaningful self-determination today. So Matthew, welcome. Thank you for being here. I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna. Appreciate you inviting me, and I'm happy to come on today and speak. For everyone out there, thanks again for sticking around. Well, we got everything taken care of. So, the comments I want to make today are going to be based around. I put up 4 myths, and I thought about how would I respond to each of these myths. So for those of you who like to take notes, the lecture will be, or the little presentation will be organized into these 4 myths. So myth number 1. Canadian history is different than other nations because it had peaceful relations with Indigenous peoples. So I think what people are largely thinking of here is comparing Canada with the United States. And in this sense, I think what people are largely thinking of is the history of expansion that these two countries have had. So after the American War of Independence in the 1770s, English-speaking people on the continent at the time really only controlled small slivers of land along the East Coast and around the St. Lawrence Seaway and a little bit into the Great Lakes region. But over the course, the remainder of the 1700s and then throughout the 1800s into the early 1900s, both of these countries, of course, engaged in a significant expansion across the rest of the continent. During the course of this expansion, what you saw was these two countries encountered different Indigenous peoples in different locations, and often what happened in the course of this expansion was violent encounters with Indigenous peoples. And so I think a lot of times when we compare these two histories between Canada and the United States, if we match them straight up, yes, the Americans did engage in more formal warfare or formal violence, large-scale warfare with Indigenous peoples than Canada. Although Canada also, of course, with the 2 Riel rebellions, engaged in this warfare against Indigenous people in order to secure its expansion as well. And so from that perspective, often it's assumed that Canada has been more peaceful with the United States. But I think there's 3 problematic aspects with this way of thinking. The first is that we can only think of violence as warfare. And this is problematic to me because if we only think of violence as warfare, we forget all the different ways in which Indigenous peoples have experienced violence in their encounters with newcomers to this continent. So for instance, a lot of the process of European colonialism, what it's created has been waves or ripple effects within Indigenous communities where these encounters have then gone and created violence within the communities that is not relegated to formal warfare. So for example, a really interesting book recently published called Clearing the Plains by James Daschuk, he details how in the late 1800s the government of Canada used starvation as a means to control Indigenous peoples. Of course, this was also only possible because of the massive decline of buffalo on the plains, which was largely accomplished through the slaughter of buffalo in the southern United States. So as we can see, these 2 policies, which wouldn't fall under the normal category of formal warfare or violence, in fact created significant violence within Indigenous communities through starvation and through the challenge to Indigenous communities that they had to respond to from these events. So the second problematic aspect, I think, is when we only think of Canada as less violent because it engaged in less formal warfare than the United States, is that it's thought of as being a historical event. So that in this way, violence is relegated to something that occurred in the past and not something that's ongoing. So for Indigenous peoples, we continue to suffer violence in our lives today from many legacies that have resulted from a history of colonialism. So these might include legacies of abuse that have been left in our communities from the severe abuse that people received at residential schools, the epidemic of missing and murdered women in this country, the brutality that Indigenous peoples receive at the hands of police, the lack of access to health care, and of course the ways in which the child welfare system continues to excessively rely on removing children from homes in order to accomplish its goals. All of these forms, of course, are very contemporary. They happen every day in our communities. And so when we relegate violence to thinking of it as formal warfare, we forget the ways in which violence occurs today, and that Canada, the way in which Indigenous peoples experience violent lives in Canada, is similar to elsewhere. So finally, when we think of violence as only through formal warfare, I think the other thing that we miss is that we don't understand the way in which not respecting Indigenous people's title to their traditional territories is a form of violence. So when Canada and Canadian society act as if they're the sole owner and primary authority over the land that we now know today as Canada, this is a form of violence. This is because Indigenous peoples have a different understanding of what the land today on Canada is. In some areas, our understanding involves treaties and different agreements which have led to which Indigenous peoples view as foundational to the creation of Canada. And in other places, these agreements don't exist, so Indigenous peoples feel that further agreements and negotiations need to take place before different sorts of extractive industries can take place over land. And so when the Canadian government and corporations ignore Indigenous peoples' claims to territory, what happens is that it's a form of violence, because Indigenous peoples are then forced into a place where we have to resist in order to have our voices heard and our concerns taken seriously. So, for example, when we see these sorts of things sometimes highly publicized in the media, such as Elsby Poctog in New Brunswick last fall over concerns about fracking. And what you see there is the occurrence of violence because the resistance gets to a point where the police move in. But realistically, these sorts of negotiations and tension points take place across the country, but they get carried out in different ways. But what the constant is that there's always the threat of violence available for Indigenous peoples should they continue to take resistance further and further. That violence will be enacted against their communities through the course of this resistance. So in this way, by not respecting Indigenous peoples' traditional territory to land, it's a form of violence even if it's not enacted on a day-to-day basis. All right. Myth number 2. Canada's laws are race-based. So one of the main tenets of liberalism, when I use the term liberalism, I don't mean the Liberal Party of Canada, but liberalism as a political ideology, is equality of individuals before the law. And so this idea also gets registered in the words of one anti-Indigenous political activist who runs a website, or maybe a better said, a campaign that's called End Race-Based Laws. So just to give a little bit of history on this concept, one of the most famous moments between Indigenous peoples in Canada is the Indigenous response to the 1969 introduction of what's formerly known as the Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy, and what's better known as the White Paper. So the White Paper proposed a number of measures based on the premise of equality of individuals before the law. Most of these proposals revolved around the removal of Indian status, or in the way in which I think of it, Indigenous peoples ceasing to be legal and politically distinct from the rest of Canada. So this would have required abolishing all previous treaties and converting remaining reserved land into private property. So this proposal should be understood as the last attempt at a failed policy of assimilation Canada pursued from its inception up until the early 70s. Initially, Canada felt that Indigenous peoples would naturally want to join Canadian society because they thought Canadian society was superior, and thus Indigenous peoples would naturally come into the fold of Canadian society. So when this did not happen, the Government of Canada put many policies in place in order to hasten assimilation, including offering Indigenous peoples the right to vote if they revoke their Indian status, involuntary revoking the Indian status of women who married non-status men, putting Native children in residential schools for the purpose of cutting off their connection to Indigenous languages, cultures, and families. But when all of these measures did not work, the final attempt was to try to legislatively end Indian status in Canada. Of course, these sorts of proposals are deeply offensive to, and were deeply offensive and are deeply offensive to Indigenous peoples. And when the white paper was proposed, Indigenous leaders stood united across the country. And due to this overwhelming response, the government of Canada was forced to withdraw the white paper. And most people now trace our current climate, which we might call a climate of recognition or accommodation, to this transformational moment. But there's two things that I want people to take away from this story. So the first is that Canada has attempted to end the legal and political distinction between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples for over 100 years, and it was a futile attempt. So the idea of bringing that back is like as a policy goal or as a goal of Canadian society today seems almost ridiculous in the mind of many Indigenous peoples, because it took over 100 years of failure before Canada changed its policy on that front. So that history, I think, is important to understand as far as understanding laws as being race-based. The second aspect of that is that when we think of this idea, the equality of individuals before the law, or the idea of ending race-based laws, what it fails to appreciate is why Indigenous peoples hold distinct status in Canada. And Indigenous peoples don't hold distinct status in Canada because they're part of a race or because they have a certain ethnicity. They hold distinct status in Canada because they're part of a nation or a political community. And it's these nations or political communities that conducted agreements and treaties with another political community, Canada, and which other people are part of. And so how these Indigenous peoples' distinct status doesn't emanate from their status as individuals underneath the law of Canada. It actually, in fact, emanates from agreements and relationships that have been created between two political communities. So the various Indigenous nations of Canada and the government of Canada. And we have to understand the status that Indigenous peoples hold in the country today is emanating from the agreement and relationship between two different political communities. Okay, myth 3, Indigenous peoples get free stuff. Similar to the last question, the rights and entitlements that flow to Indigenous peoples are because of agreements and treaties that have been made with the government of Canada. So these rights and entitlements have been in exchange for sharing the land with settlers who plan to immigrate to the area. So today, many people believe that these rights and entitlements are fair and unjust, and I think the reason for that is because of two misunderstandings. The first misunderstanding I'm going to group under the doctrine of discovery. So the doctrine of discovery held that when Europeans set foot on land, they automatically gained ownership and the ability to exercise sole political authority over the land. So the doctrine of discovery was used widely throughout the 1700s and 1800s, but has now fallen out of fashion because, of course, it's explicitly racist. It assumes one people have the right to take land from other people. But in Canada, if people do not question how this country came into existence, and you believe that this country can legitimately exist without any agreement with Indigenous peoples, you're implicitly using the doctrine of discovery. And so if you're implicitly using the doctrine of discovery, then of course you think any rights and entitlements are the result of Indigenous peoples getting free stuff. The second reason why people might think this, which would be inaccurate, would be that previous treaties and agreements were land transactions. And so from a Canadian government perspective, they were never, even if they were perceived as land transactions, the problem with this line of thinking is that historically, British authorities and Canadian authorities wanted to take this approach but didn't have enough money to either buy land from Indigenous peoples over a one-time transaction nor occur war. But from the perspective of Indigenous peoples, treaties and other agreements that have been signed are not land sales, but documents that lay out the basis of how Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples can share land and peacefully coexist with each other. And these rights and entitlements are some of the things that Indigenous peoples receive in return for sharing land. Okay, myth 4, I'm going to try to wrap this up as quickly as possible here. Colonialism is something in the past. And so colonialism, I think, is often in historical terms thought of as you have a colonial center that controls a foreign land. In this sense, decolonization means the colonial center giving up control of a foreign land. From this perspective, one might say that Canada has been decolonized because the government of Canada gained independence from Britain. Of course, this way of thinking about colonialism does not apply in Canada. Recently, a new way of talking about colonialism in contexts like Canada has emerged that people call settler colonialism. And so in settler colonialism, the colonial relationship exists between Indigenous peoples and settlers and their descendants who came to occupy the land that Indigenous peoples were living on. In this relationship, in this situation, what makes a relationship colonial is when settlers maintain the ability to control, ignore, or dominate Indigenous peoples on their lands. In this instance, what decolonization looks like is not giving up control of a foreign land, but the creation of a just treaty relationship between, on the one hand, settlers and other people who have immigrated to live in settler countries, and Indigenous peoples. And so, just as a brief ending to my presentation, until a just treaty relationship is created, colonialism will continue to exist. Otherwise, a colonial relationship based on injustice, inequity, and when necessary, force will continue to exist and characterize Canadian society. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Matthew. That was really great. As I've just been watching Twitter a little bit, and Sheila posted saying, Matthew Wildcat is giving us some real talk on Canada's attempts at cultural genocide in the most accessible way. So thank you for providing a really solid foundation that our other two panelists can jump off of and expand on and dig into as we move forward. That was really great. If any of you out there have any questions about what Matthew spoke about or want him to maybe speak a bit more about anything that he brought up, then send us an email, skillsforsolidarity@leadnow.ca, or again, post a tweet using the hashtag skillsforsolidarity. And we'd love to take some time to answer those at the end of the panel. So now to jump into our second panelist, we have Heather Dorries with us. And Heather is of Anishinaabe and European descent. She received an MSc and PhD in urban planning from the University of Toronto and is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Geography at UBC. Her research examines the role of local planning processes in eroding Indigenous sovereignty and creating conflict over land use and development. So I'm really excited to hear from Heather as she digs in quite specifically on a field that she is very close to, but I think the things she's encountered and the lessons and the challenges that she'll talk about are going to apply much more broadly. So Heather, handing it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for organizing this and inviting me to be part of this panel, and thanks to Matthew for setting this up so brilliantly. I think a lot of the things that I want to talk about demonstrate some of the ways that these myths that Matthew was talking about are reflected in planning policy processes and ultimately contribute to creating conflict between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities around issues related to urban development and planning. A lot of what I'm going to talk about really stems from my experiences in planning school and in some of the research that I've done. And maybe I should start out by talking a little bit about what planning is. When I'm talking about planning, I'm usually talking about urban planning. Urban planning is really concerned with the use and design of urban environments, issues related to land use and development, and generally is thought of as having at its core the environmental, social, and economic health of communities. And it's also sometimes thought as being a locally oriented form of policymaking. It is usually a locally oriented form of policymaking. And for most of its history over the past 100 to 50 years, planning has often been thought of as a field that's oriented towards social justice because it does have this community orientation. So one of the things that really struck me as odd when I went to planning school was the fact that there was almost no mention of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities who might be present in cities, and there was certainly no mention of the history of Canada as a settler nation. There was no discussion of treaties. There was no discussion of ongoing land claims, or how any of these histories and contemporary situations might impact planning processes and planning decision making. So what I saw was that there was kind of this unspoken assumption in planning that Canada and Canadian cities are a blank slate, open for planners to plan it as they see fit. So in many ways, there's a kind of an assumption of a terra nullius, which I think Matthew mentioned as an assumption that if there wasn't even a mention of colonial processes, it was just assumed these things were all in the past, and we can get on with the regular business of planning and developing Canada. So as I went on with my studies, I really started to question some of the wisdom of this approach and thinking about really how much Indigenous history and contemporary Indigenous claims to land could be and are impacting urban development issues, and on the flip side, how urban development really impacts the ability of Indigenous peoples to use or lay claim to their traditional territories in the present day. And this became really clear to me in the summer after my first year of planning school. And this was the summer, I guess it was 2008, and this was the summer in which the conflict in Caledonia was really erupting. And if you might recall, in the summer of 2008, this was a summer that was really marked by a lot of tension and conflict between the Six Nations community and the community in the town of Caledonia, which is in southern Ontario. And what was at issue in this case was a small 72-home housing development that had been approved by the town on land that was claimed, and that it is still claimed, by the First Nation. And that land claim continues to be unresolved today. So that really started to bring these issues to the forefront for me. And I think if we look back in Canadian history, we can see numerous examples of where municipal planning decisions, local planning decisions, often over relatively small issues, things that might have normally be thought of as being technical or insignificant, where these planning decisions have sparked significant conflict. So that the Oka standoff of 1990 might be the most significant in national memory. The Oka standoff was begun as a result of a municipal decision to expand a 9-hole golf course into a Mohawk burial ground. And that resulted in the largest deployment of the Canadian military since the Korean War. So there's a very significant political military reaction to a relatively small planning decision. But this happens because these Indigenous issues concerns the history of the land has not been taken into consideration in that planning decision making. Matthew talked a lot about violence, and I think when we look at these conflicts that are sparked by planning decisions, we can see that violence plays a role, and it is a motivating myth in the responses of governments and of the media. So the media pretends to portray these situations as problems of law and order. So they're portraying as Indigenous peoples as unruly, as violent, and in this way, in these incursions of the military or a heavy police presence is justified, and this violence. The planning decisions, which themselves could be viewed as a form of violence, right, as they take away and dispossess Indigenous people, that is also justified. So there's this other myth that I guess arises in planning situations, that Indigenous peoples are protesting simply because they are civilized and violent and unruly, and they need to be disciplined by the law. Another misconception or myth that I've encountered in planning contexts is that Indigenous peoples have no real demands, or demands that can't be unmet, or are just unsensible in terms of what they're asking for and what they're protesting about. I had the opportunity to speak to a planner, and I was telling him about some of the research I was doing, which was looking into how the planning decisions that led to the dispute in Caledonia, and he just looked at me kind of bewildered, and he said, well, I don't know what the hell those people want. If you can figure out what those people want, you'll get your own office. And that his comment kind of suggested to me that this was such a confusing situation. We could never understand what it is that Indigenous peoples are wanting, that there's really no point in trying. But I think, you know, Indigenous communities, First Nations communities have been often very clear in terms of talking about the ways that they want to be involved in planning and policy decision making. This is often related to issues about continued use and protection of important lands and sacred sites, and you know, if governments would listen, if planners would listen, these demands would actually appear quite coherent and quite sensible. A fourth myth that I have encountered in planning context is that if Indigenous peoples get what they want, if they get their land back, that everyone will have to go home and people will lose their houses, and it really means that everyone has to go back to Europe or wherever they came from. And Matthew touched on this as well when he was talking about myths about decolonization and post-colonialism. And the thing that I hear over and over again when I talk to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities is that this is really not the desired state of affairs. People are not going to lose their houses. They're not going to be asked to leave. Because what is really desired is a forum for collaborative decision-making or some sort of improvement of relations, right? More Indigenous control over Indigenous lands, but also an opportunity to exercise Indigenous forms of governance over these lands, and then to collaborate where that is necessary. I guess I'll just conclude by saying that I think what all of this points to is the importance of education, that we all have a lot of work to do in terms of learning more about the history of this place, because it really impacts decision-making at all levels. But I think the other thing I want to say is that education is also not enough. We also need to think about what we do with that education, how that impacts our relationships and the types of decisions that we'll be making in the future. In my case, that's thinking about decision-making in professional and planning contexts. But really, education is the first step, and then I think we need to have a discussion about what that will mean and how we will change the way we're working after we've begun that process of educating ourselves. So that I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker, and I look forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Heather. I love how all of you are building and expanding on what each other is saying, and kind of providing a bit of the case studies or the specifics on some of the concepts that Matthew laid out for us. So really grateful to have you here tonight. And we'll move into our third and final panelist tonight, which is Jana Ray Yerksa. So Jana Ray is Anishinaabe from Kutchaching First Nation within the Treaty 3 territory, and is a graduate from the MA in Indigenous Governance at the University of Victoria. She continues to be committed and furthering her understanding of Anishinaabe resurgence through the engagement of land-based pedagogies and Anishinaabe forms of governance, as well as deconstructing Indigenous and settler relations in the context of colonization and decolonization. So handing it over to you, Jana Ray. I'm really excited and glad you're here tonight.
Wow, that was like two great groups of panelists, right? Okay, so Bonjour. I guess the myth that I wanted to focus on is that settler colonialism is normal and natural. So oftentimes we're not aware of how we are reproducing and reinforcing colonial relationships, because many have become complicit knowingly or unknowingly and have accepted colonial realities as normal. Just to kind of reiterate what Matthew was saying, is we have to remember that this country has been built upon the marginalization and subjugation of Indigenous people in our homeland. And this continues to happen. One of the obvious ways being not honoring the treaty relationships, which is really what gives the Canadian state legitimacy. We need to be critical of our everyday interactions and interrogate ourselves in the sense of asking, are we reproducing colonial relationships? One of the ways this commonly occurs is speaking about Aboriginal issues or Aboriginal history, and oftentimes that's decontextualized from settler colonialism. I want to just tell a little story. I used to teach for the social work department at Lakehead University, and the course that I taught was social work and Aboriginal people. So a lot of the students were settler students, and you know, on the very first class, a lot of times the students would come into the classroom, you know, thinking that they're going to be talking about Indians and Indian problems. So one of the questions I would always ask the students right at the beginning is, what are the
Oh, I'm not sure if we have maybe lost Jana Ray briefly. Her internet may be running into troubles. I'm hoping, let's give her maybe 30 seconds and see if she comes back. Is she also frozen for you, Heather? Yep. Yeah, technology seems to be not our very best friend today, so apologies for everyone that's watching. This is one of the big challenges we face in trying to do this kind of work in an online environment. So I'm going to connect with Jana Ray on her cell phone, and then maybe while we're waiting for her to come back. Oh, Jana Ray, do we have you back?
Yeah.
Hooray! We were like, we're going to give her 30 seconds, and then I bet she'll be here. And here you are. So you just cut out.
I don't know what happened. Okay.
You were just saying you were just about to start getting into the story when you were teaching, but hadn't really got too far into it.
Okay. So yeah. So a lot of times the students, they were settler students, and they come to class thinking that they're going to talk about Indians and what's wrong with the Indians, what are the Indian problems, and how are they going to fix the Indian problems. So one of the ways this was really evident was when you ask them, what are some of the issues that they think Indigenous people are struggling with? And of course, you know, they identify a lot of the manifestations of settler colonialism. So they'll identify alcoholism, they'll identify poverty, they'll identify like all the ways that we are struggling because of the history and the ongoing colonization. And you know, it's never getting to the relationship piece, and I think like that's the truth, right? Is that there's not really so much there's not a such thing as Aboriginal issues, but it's more about the relationship that we've all inherited and that we continue to engage in on a daily basis. And that's one of the things that, you know, I want to talk about is because, you know, when Matthew was talking about violence and how we kind of need to reconceptualize what we think of as violence, I really agree with that. I believe that to be very true. Recently in Thunder Bay here, there was a Ontario Libertarian Party candidate that ran in the provincial election, and her whole political platform was anti-Indigenous hate speech. And, you know, I really wasn't paying too much attention to her, but when I started to pay attention was when she published an ad in our city's newspaper. It was a huge huge page in the newspaper, and she actually talked about some of the myths that Matthew tried to debunk there, and she literally said that she wanted to stop the gravy train with Native people, and talked about how there's no such things as Native land, it's everybody.
Oh, we've lost her again. It's very strange because we've got her hardwired into the internet, so her internet shouldn't be cutting out like this so much. And we've had her all evening until, of course, the time when it is her chance to speak. All right, January, you've got 15 seconds to jump back in. Otherwise, we'll ask a question for Heather that's come up based on what you just spoke about. Also, if any folks out there do have questions, it would be great to send them our way. We've got a couple good ones, but we'd love to see a few more. So don't hesitate to send them in. Okay, so I think we're going to jump to a question for you, Heather, and then when January gets back, we'll let you finish wrapping up that, and then we will finish hearing from her. So our question is...
I think January just came back.
I don't know. I keep crashing.
We keep almost going to a question for Heather, and then as we're about to like hand over the question to her, you leap back into the Hangout. So let's try one more time, and if we lose you again, then we will go to a question for Heather. And when you jump back into the Hangout, we'll just wait till she finishes answering, and then we'll continue with where you were going. How's that sound? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I might keep crashing.
We've had you all night so far, so my fingers are crossed that'll be it 2 times and it's over. So, all right, go for it. You were talking about the libertarian from Thunder Bay. Thanks.
Right. And did you hear the part about the ad in the newspaper?
I would just, a little bit, but I'd just start right in there with.
Okay, so, you know, so her ad wasn't really seen as violent. It wasn't seen as racist. And I think, like, the fact that it wasn't recognized as such speaks to how normalized the violence has become towards Indigenous people. And we're still living in a time where we need to recognize that, you know, we need to diagnose that, recognize that, and be critical of that. So the other thing is like every day, you know, we engage in conversations with each other, and there's a lot of check back messages that happen where we talk about, you know, that was a long time ago, or this has nothing to do with me, or you know, not all settlers are like that. We don't, or even to use the term settler is sometimes considered as hostile. It's met with a hostile reaction. And that really speaks to the normalization of settler colonialism and the need to continue to diagnose it, you know, and have forums like this where we're talking about these things rather than always focusing on educating non-Indigenous people about Indigenous culture or Indigenous ways of life that are decontextualized from settler colonialism, that doesn't call on settler society to be responsible and to unlearn things and to learn new ways of engaging with Indigenous people. So, you know, those everyday acts of violence are sometimes seen as less harmful because they're so normal, but they definitely have everything to do with the murdered and missing Indigenous women. They have everything to do with residential school. and they're not any less harmful. So until Canada, Canadians, and Indigenous people confront their colonial mindsets, society will continue to remain sick and the violence won't stop. So I agree with the last speaker that, you know, education and action are really needed.
Amazing, and yay, we had you till the end, so I'm really grateful that you got your internet to stick around, and I have lots of questions based on what you said, so I'm excited to jump into that part of the evening now. So again, if you have questions, you can send them to skillsforsolidarity@leadnow.ca or post on Twitter, #skillsforsolidarity. And the first question is for you, Heather. It's a combo of a few different pieces. But it came through email, and it mentions that you work very specifically in making decisions about how land is used, or you work with planners that do. However, I imagine there are subtle ways in which people are making decisions all the time about the land around us. Where might we not be noticing that the choices we're making are having an impact on Indigenous peoples? And then sort of a sub add-on to that is, apart from the municipal planning context, what other aspects of municipal and provincial governments can we actively work to decolonize? So maybe they're a bit separate, but you can tackle those however makes sense for you.
Yeah, I'm gonna start with the first two questions, and maybe if you could put the text of the last one in the chat, because I'm not going to remember it. I really like those questions. Those are very subtle questions, because you're absolutely right. Decisions about how land is used, how environments are used, are not just made by governments. They're made by all of us when we make decisions about the types of lives we want to lead, the types of resources we want to consume. You know, all of these decisions eventually have effects on the environment, and Indigenous environments. Not that I'm trying to separate those two things. And I don't know if I have a precise answer about specific actions that individuals can take when they're thinking about the ways that their actions impact these environments that I mean affect us all eventually. But rather being aware of those and letting that awareness of the interconnectedness of communities, of environments, being aware of the ways our decisions impact environmental use, Indigenous land use, I think is a really important starting point. And then when it comes to municipal aspects other than municipal planning contexts, working to decolonize governments, I mean, I think that's a very big question. I know from what I've seen from the municipal planning context is that political will is incredibly important. One of the things that I was very surprised to find out was that in the case of Caledonia, and I'm sure this is the case in other instances across Canada, so when I started looking at that case, I assumed that the planners and that the municipality was simply unaware of the potential impacts of their decisions to develop that land that had been claimed by the Indigenous community. In fact, what I found out is that they were quite aware of the potential impacts. They were quite aware of, they had a very good idea of how that community might react, but ultimately, in doing a cost-benefit analysis, felt that the economic benefits of development outweighed any threat to that development that might be posed by, you know, the reaction of the Indigenous community. I think they were proven wrong, but you know, there was a very they did know how that might turn out. There was not the political will didn't exist, and the broader community will didn't exist there, I think, to make another decision. so I think we all have a role there to play in providing some of that political will, some of that broader community will to take other directions.
Awesome. Thanks for taking those two on, Heather. That's great. Our next question is really for anyone that wants to respond. And that I've sort of built off of a comment that Lily on Twitter made. So her comment was, a treaty relationship will be the end of colonialism? There's also that racism part. So would one of you be able to speak to how you see the relationship between building new treaty relationships, connecting with also challenging the racism that we see around us? And any of you, all of you, whoever would like to speak, please go for it.
Sure, I'll jump in on that one. So yeah, no, it's a great point, and I think racism was one of the aspects that I didn't touch on a whole bunch in my talk, but I think what I would hope is that the creation of a just treaty relationship necessarily relies upon, maybe if not the complete elimination of racism, at least the relegation of racism to being something that doesn't have any sort of significant impact or effect in our society anymore. So the creation of a treaty relationship unnecessarily, I think, it involves to some degree the elimination of racism.
Cool. Is there anyone else that wants to jump in on that one? All right. Awesome. Thanks. And I think it's something we want to keep exploring as we move forward into the next panels as well. So our next question is on Twitter. It comes from EP Bryn. So the question is, with the Supreme Court acknowledging Aboriginal title, how will that change things with how Canada interacts with First Nations? And so I'm assuming that they're referring to the recent Chilcotin decision. So if one of you wants to respond to that, if you could maybe give like a very brief, tiny, I know it's a huge thing that happened, but any sort of summary of what that was and what you think the impacts would be. I think a lot of people are still uncertain what will happen based on that decision, but if you want to dig into that a little bit, that would be great. And we have a little side chat going with our panelists, and they're like, ooh, good questions, hard questions, which is definitely true. Heather? Jana Ray, they're all smiling a lot. Or even resources that people could go to find out more about the decision that you know of. I know recently West Coast Environmental Law wrote a blog about it. So if folks are interested in reading about some analysis of the Chilcotin decision, you can search it, and they wrote out something really great about how they see the impacts of that Supreme Court decision, what it might be in terms of Aboriginal rights and title. So
I will say one thing. I think we're all reluctant because it's a really hard question, and certainly it'll have very big impacts. And if we look back at the history of important legal decisions that have affected Aboriginal rights across Canada, it always takes a while to see exactly what the impact is. I mean, we have legal principles being established, and they are sometimes transformed as they are transposed from these legal contexts to policy contexts, which is often where the rubber really hits the road. And I do want to say one more thing about legal decisions in general, which is that while these types of legal decisions are often viewed as victories because of the ways that they affirm Aboriginal and treaty rights, we also, I think it's important to think about what is lost when we rely on the courts to affirm the rights of Indigenous peoples, because when we rely on Supreme Court's decisions, we're really relying on the colonial, the apparatus of the colonial state to affirm the political legitimacy that Indigenous communities are asserting. Yeah, so I think it really gives us a lot to think about. I don't have anything specific to say about that case yet. To be honest, I haven't spent a lot of time reading it, so I don't feel quite ready to make a pronouncement about that. But maybe one of the other panelists has something to add.
I actually have something to add, but not about the case. But similar to what you were talking about, I think we tread into really dangerous territory when we do look to the colonial courts to affirm Indigenous sovereignty. You know, Indigenous law and knowledge is legit and it stands on its own, and we don't need to look for that recognition. I think that when we do, it's really disempowering to Indigenous nations. So, yeah.
Great. I really agree with what both Heather and Jen Ray are saying there. I kind of have, I guess, three comments to make about the question. The first would be that of course, within the decision, the Crown or the Canadian legal system still has the power to infringe upon Aboriginal title. So Aboriginal title is not an exclusive right to land. It's just a form of property title that exists within the Canadian legal system. So in this sense, you can almost read it that Aboriginal title within the Canadian legal system is something that actually doesn't disqualify the doctrine to discovery. Canada still retains the right to be the ultimate authority and decision maker over land. So from that perspective, Aboriginal title is a form of property right, and it's actually a rather weak one at that. Sorry, I made both 2 points in that one. The second point, though, I think if we do want to talk about what it does change, it does change stuff because it changes the cost-benefit analysis of corporations and of governments when they think about conducting activities. And so what that means is this was all things said and done, a beneficial title. It was a win for Indigenous peoples. But how that plays out may not play out in a changed relationship. Like Heather is talking about, what it requires is people making different decisions on the ground about how we have a relationship with each other. So unfortunately, does this title translate into people thinking differently about the way in which Aboriginal title exists in Canada, the way in which Indigenous legal orders might be included within decision making about what it means to have a treaty or just relationship over living on the land? So from that sense, it's not the sort of change that we ultimately need. Yes, it does create a different cost-benefit analysis because courts and governments may be more afraid to do certain things that they might not have been in the past. But what we ultimately need is a new way of thinking about how we have a relationship with each other. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks all of you for jumping in on that. I know it's a really new decision. It just came down in late June. So for those of you who are interested in learning more, Kelly just posted the West Coast Environmental Law article on our Twitter, and I will add that to the additional resources page on Skills for Solidarity. And then from there, I just encourage you to leap off into Google and see what's been written about this pretty big decision. Okay, so another question. Again, these are all pretty general for any of you that want to jump in, but this is from Amy on Twitter. Any thoughts about Indigenous governance structures that settlers could learn about to decolonize legal systems? So thoughts about Indigenous governance structures that settlers could learn about in order to help decolonize legal systems. And I'm happy again for all of you, any of you one of you to just, if you have any thoughts on that. Maybe Matthew? Oh. All right. Matthew.
Sure. I'll jump back in. So I think the easy one that comes to mind is obviously how you conceptualize land and having a relationship with land. So if you know, these are obviously, I think, this is a very simple dichotomy that I'm about to draw, but I think it's still effective in some ways. But if you think of land as a resource that can be exploited for creating wealth, it leads to thinking about land in a certain way that creates certain sorts of decisions. Whereas if you think about land as something that you have a relationship with, something that informs how you think about the world and how you make decisions in order to have relationships with other people and other non-human beings, animals and such. What it then does is it changes how you make decisions about things. And so one of the things that's often thought about Indigenous peoples is that Indigenous peoples conducted their societies and their political orders in the way that they did because they didn't have sophisticated or advanced enough technology to exploit the land, rather than it being active decision-making and agency on the part of Indigenous peoples to think and talk about what sort of obligations and responsibilities they have towards the land, towards different animals and other beings. And so this is obviously, you know, the big one. But I also think that there is all sorts of other ideas that can be drawn upon in terms of how you think about generating political legitimacy. Obviously, in the Western tradition, legitimacy is thought to reside in an office or a title holder, whereas in most Indigenous political traditions, legitimacy is thought as something that you have to build up through a long record of prudent action and good decision-making, acting in the right interest of other people, being humble, being empathetic to others, and those sorts of decisions. And so that, to me, I think is also a potential you know, a very emancipatory idea for thinking about, you know, how we give people authority to make decisions on behalf of others. You know, do we give it because they hold a certain office or a certain title, or is it because they've, through their actions and through their records, shown that they have the ability to provide good stewardship and guidance on behalf of groups? Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Matthew. We've got a few more left on the stack, so let's go to one from Claire by email. Again, for any of you, maybe Jenna or Heather, if you want to jump in, she's asking, do you have other examples of what the new relationship could look like? So I think a lot of times throughout the panel it's been referred to. Is it happening anywhere in a good way? What does it look like? Do you know anything about the background of how that might have come about or happened? So just any case studies of small or large where things do look a bit differently, and how do they look differently? What is this? How could this new relationship look?
I'll give an example, like even right here in Thunder Bay, where the racism has become like very overt recently. It's always been there, but really overt. We started working with a group of people that kind of probably similar to people that are participating on this Leadnow Settlers for Solidarity or Skills for Solidarity. We organized a teach-in to talk about racism in a different way and link it to the root of settler colonialism. And you know, how we did that was we centered our own Anishinaabe ways of doing things, but part of our organizing group was with settlers, you know, that have similar politics and similar desires. So I think that's a real concrete, everyday kind of example. And, you know, I agree with what was said earlier about like the education piece is just the beginning, but it's how you put that into action. you know, and getting comfortable with that. There's lots of work to do on a daily basis.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen-Rae. Heather, did you want to add anything, or Matthew? All right. Hopefully, I think in panel 4, we're also going to dig into that a bit more. So the 4th panel is on working together towards a new relationship and bringing in some voices that work in communities and can share some specific examples and case studies so that some of these concepts and ideas that we're playing around with can just keep becoming more and more and more tangible and familiar for all of us. So, okay, I've got one from Matthew. His question is, lots of these myths come up in day-to-day interactions with others, either subtly or not so subtly. Do any of the speakers have suggestions for how we can work to debunk myths in our day-to-day lives? So I think referring to how sometimes it's these systems and practices and policies feel kind of far away or disconnected, and how can we bring this into our own lives in real and tangible ways. And I think what you just referred to, Jen-Rae, is a really great example. So that might partially answer the question, but if there's anything else out there.
I think too, like, not being intimidated to speak up, you know, like, I mean, even participating on this panel, like, I feel a little bit intimidated because I don't have all the answers. Like, I don't know, you know, like, we're just figuring this out too. And so I think a lot of times people talk about they be silent because they feel like they don't know enough about the issue, but they know enough to know that whatever is being said is wrong, you know. So I think it's about confronting that in those everyday kind of interactions, not being intimidated. And I think that's how we start to create a different normal rather than the violence that is normal towards Indigenous people.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Thank you. And I think, thank you for that reminder. We've talked about it a little bit in earlier panels, but that comfort with just jumping in when you don't know and remembering that, yeah, we're all figuring this out and the answer isn't out there somewhere. We've got to create it together, and that it might not always be easy, or we might not always do it right, but that we've got to be willing to jump in order to change this stuff. So we've got one last question from Christy on Twitter. If there were one or two things someone could do to help repair this relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canadians, what could some of those steps be? So maybe just a last word from each of you on that, if you have something to add, would be wonderful, and then we'll still wrap at around 7 o'clock in case folks watching have things to head off to in their evenings. So one or two steps folks could take. We've talked a lot about education, but is there anything else on your mind that you'd want to leave people with?
I can start. And it's a great question, and it's a difficult question because, as Jen-Rae said, I think we're all still figuring this out, and we're all in a lot of different contexts where we need to be doing this work. I think that, and I think we've all talked about some of these steps, and I think there's probably more that we need to figure out in the future. Certainly, education is a big part of it. We have so much to learn, and I know that I'm still learning new things every day. So that in itself is a pretty big job. But then also thinking about, you know, where we can apply this in our own lives. What contexts are we in where we can do some work to push against and to debunk some of these myths and these misconceptions and these, you know, just things that are not considered. How do we work on that in our own context? And it is a big project because it's so new for so many of us. And it is scary, like Jen-Rae said. You know, it's going to take some courage to start on that journey.
Awesome, thank you. Jan, Ray, or Matthew, any last thoughts to add about this stuff? Leave people with?
Yeah, so I think there's been a lot of really great comments that have been made. Just going back to the last question really briefly about things you can do, how you confront people. I think that there's always two things and they're kind of in tension with each other. One is you always have to gauge the context that you're in, and you should always do things that you feel at least somewhat comfortable with, and that allow you to continue to put in an effort in day out over time, stuff that's not going to burn you out. At the same point, unless people are willing to go into zones where they're uncomfortable and that challenge the status quo, these sorts of transformations that we want to see aren't going to happen. And so there does need to be, from time to time, and when the moment and the when everything aligns, the need to put your ideas on the line and to put your commitment on the line in order to make things happen. And so, I really like Heather's frame of a lot of it is education, and that's why I've gone into to doing the PhD. I hope to teach and to continue to advance ideas on all of this. But ultimately, that education has to translate into action in some sort of way. And so the action is really what ultimately gets things done. And hopefully, people can be creative and thoughtful about how they can undertake actions in order to affect change.
Amazing. Thank you. Any last thoughts from you, Jen Ray?
Yeah, I guess like a couple of questions, rather than suggestions, but like just things to think about. What are the stories you've heard about the land we now call Canada? What are the stories you've heard about Indigenous people of this land, and how have these stories impacted the way you see yourself in relation to the land and the Indigenous people of this land? I like what Matt was talking about in terms of, not burning yourself out. Though that's like a lesson that I continue to struggle with, and I think it's important to work with the workable ones, because you're going to encounter people that are really comfortable with their colonial privilege. And so it's not about like changing those minds, but I think it's about working with workable people and practicing personal agency.
Amazing. Y'all are so great. I'm so grateful that you've been with us here tonight, and that we've had an opportunity to dig into a lot of really hard and really awesome questions from folks watching. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us tonight. And again, apologies for the tech glitches earlier on. We're really grateful that you stuck around. If you happen to miss the beginning of the panel because you hadn't quite caught up with where we were live streaming it, then it will be available on the Module 3 page pretty much right away. I'll transfer the YouTube link over there so you can catch up and watch that one. And if you missed any of the earlier panels, they are there as well. So encourage your friends to watch those if they're wanting to take part. We're still confirming the date for the next panel, but it'll be in late August, and there'll be updates on the announcements page, and we'll send you an email about that. It'll be the week of August 25th to 28th. And in that panel, we're going to start digging into stories and thoughts about what it looks like to work together. So what is this new relationship? What are the possibilities of that, and what challenges does this also present? And confirmed panelists so far include Crystal Lehman from the Beaver Lake Cree Nation and Robin Sutherland, who works with an initiative called 4Rs. So I'll update that announcements page as soon as we know the date is confirmed. Again, if you have any questions or feedback, send them our way, skillsforsolidarity@Leadnow.ca, and let folks, again, know that if they want to join later on, the program recordings and the workbooks will all be available on the website after the program's over, so there's still lots of time to join in and catch up on the conversation. And also a thank you to those of you watching who have contributed a small donation to help make this program happen. If you're finding the program interesting and want to support us in offering learning opportunities like this, then we'd love it if you made a small contribution, whatever you can, at Leadnow.ca/donate. And otherwise, thank you. Enjoy your evenings. I hope they're filled with lots of interesting things to think about, because we've had some pretty incredible panelists with us tonight. So again, a huge thank you to the three of you for spending your evenings with us and bringing your knowledge and wisdom and all those great things. And it's been a pleasure being with you all tonight. And we will see you all next time. Good night, everyone.